So we have implemented authentication. Now it's time to implement authorization. So by authorization, I mean the user should not be able to access the resources they are not allowed to. For example, here when I log in, I can access this manage orders or manage products pages. These are pages specific for admins. So how can we prevent normal users from accessing these pages? We need to define the concept of role in our application. Now, in Firebase, we don't have the concept of roles or authorization. We only have authentication. So here on Firebase console, we only have authentication where we deal with the list of our users. In order to put these users in certain roles, we need to store them in our database. So look, our database is currently empty. We need to store our users here, and then we can give each user one or more roles. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to store a user in this database. Back in app component, here when the user logs in, we should store them in our database. Now, as I told you before, anytime we want to work with Firebase, we should encapsulate our code inside a service to have better separation of concerns and testability. So open up the terminal and generate a new service, ng-gs user. We're going to use this user service to work with user objects in our database. So let's generate this, okay? Now let's go to app module and register this service as a provider. So user service. Now let's go to this user service. Here in the constructor, we need to inject an Angular Fire database object. So private DB of type Angular Fire database. Let's import this. Okay. Now I'm going to add a save method that takes a user object, and this user is of type firebase.user. Now, even though we have IntelliSense here, technically we should import Firebase on the top. Otherwise, we might get a compilation error later. So import everything as Firebase from Firebase. So in this save method, we simply want to call this .db.object. The location of this object in our database should be something like this: users / and here we need to append the user ID. So as I told you before, these Firebase user objects have a property called UID or unique identifier. So we access this object. Now here we can either call the set or the update method. I'm going to use the update method because maybe in the future we're going to add a profile for each user, and in that profile we're going to have lots of fields. Every time the user logs in, we don't want to overwrite the value of these fields. We only want to update the user's name and potentially their email, because it is possible that the user may go outside our application. They may go to Google and update their name there. So when they log in, we want to have their up-to-date full name. So here I'm going to call the update method. For now, give it two properties: name, which we set to user.displayName, and this is the same value we display in our navigation bar. And the second property is email, which we set to user.email. So this is our user service. Now back in our app component, when the user logs in, we're going to call user service.saveUser. So first we need to inject our user service here, private user service of type user service. Let's import this. And then here call user service dot save, and we give it this user object. Now you might argue that this approach is inefficient because every time the user logs in, we're trying to save them to the database. But in a traditional application, we save our users only when they register. Well, there are a couple of things you need to consider here. The first thing is that in this application, we don't have the concept of registration. So the user logs in and can access certain features. Sure, in the future, we can add a registration form, and then we can save the user as part of the registration process. However, as I told you before, With these OAuth providers, it is possible that the user may update their name or potentially their email address outside the scope of our application. So with this technique, every time they log in, we ensure that we have their up-to-date name stored in our database. Okay, now let's test this. So back in our application, I'm going to log out first, then log in one more time with Google. And then let's take a look at our database. You can see we have this node, users. This is my user ID in Firebase. It's a unique value. And here are the email and name properties. So we have the users. Next, we're going to define roles for our users.